We're going to call the City Council Charter Review Joint Workshop with the Advisory Board to order.
Mayor Thomas Masters.
Present.
Chairperson Tanya Davis Johnson. Chair Pro Tem Lynn Hubbard.
Present.
Councilperson Kashamba Miller Anderson.
Present.
Councilperson Julia Botel.
Here.
Councilperson Terrence Davis. City Manager Karen Hoskins.
Present.
City Clerk Claudine Anthony is present. City Attorney Andrew DeGraffenwright.
Here.
And Madam Chair, we also have Attorney David Walpin, who is the legal counsel for the Charter Review Advisory Board, Mr. Javaris Jackson, who is the chairperson for the board, Dr. Guy Despino, who's the secretary for the board, and Mr. Keith Golden, who is an alternate board member that's present with us this evening.
Thank you. We'll stand at this moment for a moment of silence and a pledge to the pledge of allegiance to the flag by Kashamba Miller Anderson, Councilwoman.
I thought we was going to pick straws for a minute.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Okay.
Madam Chair, we're going to proceed with the agenda as printed. What we will do first is have a presentation by Chairperson Jackson as well as Attorney Walpin. I am quite sure they are open to you having questions during their presentation. However, it may be more beneficial if you hold your questions until after the presentation. After the presentation and your questions, then you all can proceed with what you all would like to be presented to the voters.
So we're going to they're going to present the items that was issued in the presentation that we received. So in order to discuss each one as we go, don't you think that'll be more interactive as opposed to
Whatever
waiting
the pleasure of the
till the
board.
full presentation is over? And again, it's the pleasure of the board. How would you prefer? Each one or the full presentation done? Or would you like to discuss each one? What are you guys comfortable with?
We will go with the pleasure of the board.
Okay. Go ahead, gentlemen.
Madam Chair,
As
before he starts, I have a very important announcement to make, and I want to make it before they start for the benefit of the people who are still bringing items to the fire station.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Just want to inform everyone who has items that you want to bring to the fire station. Everything needs to be there no later than Thursday. So whatever you have, including baby Pampers, bottled water, canned food, dry food, clothing, personal hygiene items, whatever you have, please get them to the main fire station no later than Thursday by 7 p.m. And I want to thank all the pastors, Pastor Lofton, Pastor Tyson, Pastor Bentley, Pastor of Mount Olive, and all the ministers who are working along with Pastor Teresa Nelson, that we will be able to take a truckload of things going up to, we've been diverted, instead of North Carolina, we'll be going to Florida, be helping our fellow Floridians, Quincy and Mariana. And if you have relatives there or know people who are your friends very closely, if you bring items and if you mark them for certain families, please mark that on the box and their phone number. We want to make sure that we help those people that may have relatives from here that are there as well individually. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Councilwoman.
If Ms. Anthony can give just a short overview, or are we going to have Mr. Jackson just kind of explain the charter review, when they're going to be, when this goes on the ballot, or what the process is?
I think that's going to be included in the
That's a part of the
presentation
presentation? Okay.
presentation that'll come from the two gentlemen
Okay.
there. Okay, so we'll give them, go ahead and start.
Javarius Jackson, Riviera Beach. Good evening, Mayor, City
Good
Council,
evening.
staff, and residents of Riviera Beach. I stand before you today serving as the chairman for the Charter Review Advisory Board. The board is comprised of seven regular members and 2 alternates who has extensive expertise in both the public and private sector. And let me tell you, if you think dealing with 5 brothers and sisters is difficult, try dealing with 8. Each who possess strong personalities and views. So my role was not easy. Nonetheless, I have enjoyed every moment and thank my colleagues for entrusting me in steering the ship. So before we begin, I would like those who are in the audience to just introduce themselves to the board and for those at at home.
Guy Despino, Riviera Beach, kind of new here 2 years. Pleasure to serve you.
Keith Dolan, Riviera Beach, Riviera Beach resident, proud to serve as well.
Thank you.
So the board began its journey on August 14, 2017, and has completed a thorough review of the city charter. The charter serves as the constitution for the city. The charter was originally adopted on April 17, 1963, and amended for the first time in March of 2008, where in 2008, 16 of the 18 ballot questions were approved by the electors of Riviera Beach. The 2008 amendments updated the 1973 charter. The purpose of the Charter Review Board is to examine the city charter and make suggestions for updates, amendments, and changes that would make city government operations and policies more productive, effective, and efficient. The charter should be looked at as the foundation by which the city government runs the administrative functions of government. As stated earlier, the board went through a comprehensive review of the city charter from examining various municipal charters throughout the state of Florida. And some board members went as far as conducting research on various charters nationwide. In addition, the board received various comments, correspondence, documents, and presentations to help guide the board during the course of this process, such as a presentation from Lynn Tipton from the League of Cities, comments from the Supervisor of Elections for Palm Beach County, Riviera Beach Department Directors. City Manager Karen Hoskins provided a legislative budget presentation, comments from the public, and of course, Ms. Anthony served as the board's subject matter expert. Right now, the choices our elected officials make have a significant outcome on the residents' daily lives. Presently, we know that our democracy is being challenged, and we see it every time we turn the news on. We see it in Washington, we hear it in Tallahassee, and we must do our part to ensure our government, starting locally, stands the test of time. In order to accomplish this task, we must guarantee good governance to the residents of Riviera Beach by creating a sense of buy-in to the success of the city, a government that is transparent, held accountable, and responsive to the needs of the community. So I ask council to enter this process with an open heart and open mind to some of the proposed changes, which to date are not final, subject to further discussion with the Charter Review Board. And at this time, I will turn it over to our board attorney, Mr. David Wolpin, who has acquired a wealth of knowledge and experience in municipal government and who has been nothing but professional and attentive to the board. Mr. Wolpin will read and review the proposed changes, and he will opine on any questions council may have on the language, and will then entertain an open and respectful dialogue between City Council and the Charter Review Board. At this time, Mr. Wolpin, thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, Mr. Wolpin.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson. Appreciate the opportunity to work with the city. My name is David Wolpin. I'm a partner with the law firm of Weiss Roeder Helfman. My office is located in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Our law firm also has offices in Boca Raton, Coral Gables, and Fort Lauderdale. I had the privilege of working with the city back in 2008 when Kerry Ward was a longtime city clerk at that time. I worked on the charter review process. Back in 2008, it was necessary to amend the outdated 1973 charter. So because of that, at that time, there was 20 different charter amendments that were presented to the electors of the city. 16 of those 20 items were approved by the voters, which is a very impressive performance by the voters to have the patience to go through that many items. And Mayor Masters, was the mayor back that time as well, so I'm sure he remembers that as well. I appreciate the opportunity to work with the board. I commenced my work as legal counsel to the Charter Review Board this past July, and I've enjoyed working with the board. It's an excellent group of people. There's been excellent discussion and debate on the various issues. A little information on the charter process is that the board intends to or plans on wrapping up its work of reviewing and making recommendations during the month of November, so that in December the City Council will be able to consider adoption of an ordinance on 2 readings that would place before the voters whatever charter amendments you deem appropriate. It's strictly up to the City Council which of the recommendations of the Charter Review Board you approve for submittal to the electors. That's within your absolute discretion. Nothing has yet been finalized by the Charter Review Board. As further board meetings is scheduled and further review will be done, but the Charter Review Board wanted a chance to obtain the input of the City Council and Mayor before the Charter Review Board reaches its final recommendations. During the course of the meetings of the board, a couple of the council members and the mayor have attended and observed some of the proceedings of the board. But we appreciate you taking the time to meet with the board as a joint workshop this evening. And we understand that the reason I stated the board intends to wrap up its efforts in November and present a proposed ordinance to the council for adoption in December is that the county supervisor of elections has advised us that the date for the deadline of submission of proposed charter amendments for inclusion on the March ballot is December 29th, 2018. So being the target has been to get on that March ballot for any items that you all desire, this is the schedule that we have at this time. At this time, I'd like to go over the proposed, and I must emphasize proposed, 8 different amendments that the Charter Review Board has tentatively recommended. The board chairman, Javarius, has created a PowerPoint of these 8 proposed items, which we show the proposed text of the charter amendment changes. It should be, excuse me, Mayor?
Yes, I do have a
Another
question,
question?
Madam Chair.
Yes, please.
The 4 items that were superly rejected by the residents, the voters rather, of Riviera Beach, it was a super majority. It was like 66% up to 70 and whatever, and maybe more. Do you recall what the 4 were? I do recall 3, but do you recall the 4?
I recall one of them was the item on the ballot was to delete or repeal the mayor's authority to suspend city officers and employees. The voters rejected that amendment.
And that was like 66% of the vote. It was a high number.
Another one I know is a change in the special assessment formula for public improvements. That was rejected by the voters. And then there was one concerning the salary provision. That was rejected by the voters. And I don't recall what the 4th item was.
Well, there were 2 that you probably don't remember. One was the mayor's veto. And it seems like whenever there's a charter review, they pick on the mayor for some reason. At least that's what I think, whoever the mayor may be. But one was rejected by the voters, over 66%, and that was the veto power of the mayor. And the other one that was rejected by the same percentage of voters was the term limit.
That's right. There was a term limit provision
Term limit.
that was rejected.
That was interesting because the term limits won everywhere else except Riviera Beach, and that's because we fought hard against it. And all of those 3, the 2 mayoral and the term limits terribly failed. The voters rejected that over 65% of the vote.
Right.
I just
Mayor,
wanted to refresh your memory, that's
Right, I
all.
hadn't remembered the term limit one. I remember there was at that time a proposed adjustment of the length of the term, but I'm sure you're accurate with the
Right.
recitation of
And
the
were you
items.
able to share that information with the committee?
I believe the city clerk presented to the committee the charter questions. I don't know if
She
they
did.
were presented with the actual results of each item. But the city clerk has been extremely helpful to the board, and I'm sure she will be able to present the resolution that certified the
Yeah, I don't know what
results
the
at
vote will be,
March
not the vote, but I don't know what the reaction will be from my fellow colleagues. But I'm going to direct the city clerk to, at your next charter review, to get those numbers on each one of those that failed. And I'm sure the supervisor has it on the website. But it was, I hate to see the waste of taxpayer dollars. I think if they knew how badly those items failed, I don't think they want to bring them back again. But if they do, no problem. Thank you.
Thank you.
You may proceed.
So at this time, at the pleasure of the council, I'd like to go over the 8 tentatively proposed amendments. You recall back in July, we wrote to the city council asking for your input or a joint workshop. In between that, the summer came, the budget hearing scheduled, so we appreciate you taking the time tonight to meet with the board, and we'd like to have your input on these or other things of concern to you all. The first item, the chairman will pop up on the screen for you, and you also have a copy that the city clerk has provided in front of you. First item, number 1, is a proposed amendment to create a non-interference clause between the legislative and administrative branches. And basically, this is a clause that is found in similar form in other city charters that would say, if placed on the ballot and if approved by the voters, it would put text into the charter that would say, except for the purposes of inquiry and information, the members of the city council are expressly prohibited from interfering with the performance of the duties of any employee other than their aides or assistants who are under the direct supervision or indirect supervision of the city manager. Such action shall be malfeasance within the meaning of section 112.51 Florida statutes. In other words, a provision like this, if adopted into the charter, would prohibit a city council member from giving an order to an employee who is under the supervision of the city manager. It would be a serious matter because theoretically, if a violation of that occurred, it would constitute grounds under section 112.51 for the governor to take action and even theoretically remove that offending councilman from office. So that's a provision that is found in quite a few city charters to preserve the power of the city manager to administer city affairs. That's one item that is at this time tentatively recommended by the Charter Review Board. I would proceed to the next item unless you have a question on this particular one.
I have a question, Madam Chair.
Yes, please, go ahead,
I think
Madam.
the language may be ambiguous and kind of broad because I'm not for sure what interfering means. What does that mean, interfering with the performance of the duties?
Right.
What is that?
That would mean to give an order. For example, if a council member would order the building official not to issue a permit for a new restaurant or to issue a permit for a new restaurant, that would be an interference. This is not the final language, so it would be subject to further clarification as necessary, and we'll be happy to do so.
Well, question, yeah, if the 3 colleagues feel that's necessary, but I don't know what would be the need of it because I think we have stuff on the books now that would protect the employee. I think, like you said, the governor, as far as interfering with, I don't see the need unless there has been an abuse, and I'm not for sure if that has taken place, that would necessitate this type of, to be in the charter. I think we already have stuff that protects the parties that are involved. That's just my feel. I didn't know what that, it doesn't really say to me, giving order. We know already that elected officials cannot give orders to employees. The city manager does that. So what you're saying is that you feel there needs to be more teeth to this?
This was recommended by the board. It was recommended in the earlier proceedings of the board before I was working with the board. I've only been working with the board since July, but it is a common variations of this are commonly found in various city charters that I've dealt with. I've dealt with many cities over the years. I've been working in local government law for approximately 41 years, and I have seen provisions like this, but we could certainly clarify it. And I also want to point out, we're not asking the city council tonight to bless anything finally. We just look for your input and to let you know what the board's working on.
Yes, the question that I have with this is this a new creation, or is this a modification of the
This is a new
charter
provision.
that was of the charter for this particular item?
Right, this would be a new creation. It would be brand-new text that, if approved, would be inserted into the charter. So yes, it is a new provision.
Okay, I guess the criminal element, the part of it is such action shall be malfeasance within the meaning of. And I guess that's my only concern, is because most times employees and residents want to have their cake and eat it too. When things are going wrong, they will come to us to ask for input or suggestions. And when the residents can't get to the administration, then they come to us and they want us to bid on their behalf. So it's kind of hard to represent a body of people and not be able to speak on their behalf to the administration. That's what they want. That's what they ask for, advocacy. And there, you know, and there's a difference, and I think we all know the difference between advocacy, seeking information, broaching the subject with the person that's in authority. But again, I don't think there's any council people that just wake up and say, hey, I'm going to the department head or I'm going to the city manager to interfere on behalf of Joe Blow. Chances are, if we are talking to a city manager or a department head, that means that an employee or a constituent felt like they could not get anywhere or even get a sit down. So the criminal part of it is what I take exception with, because like I said, most of us and most constituents and most employees want to have their cake and eat it too. So they're going to call us to interfere, and then we're going to be subject to criminal actions for interfering.
Madam Chair.
I think that's the very kind of input that we're looking for, and we could certainly clarify the provision that doesn't prohibit the council members from being responsive to the public. It simply prohibits them from improperly giving orders to city staff. That can certainly
Not
be
the
clarified.
city manager.
Right.
So when they're talking about the employees underneath the city manager.
Right, also, you know, individual council members would not give an order to the manager. Now, as the body, the manager
You're
works
saying
for
individually.
individual, right? So, you know, that's the type of thing that you know, is prohibited, as you all know. You would not individually give an order to the manager.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I don't see this as doing anything other than codifying what we all believe to be proper behavior. So I'm not sure that it violates anything that we typically do or would be expected to do as council people. I think it's perfectly appropriate to have something like this in our charter. I think it just says to us, this is the kind of behavior we expect of ourselves. You know, that it's in the charter and not just something that's understood only makes it more easy to enforce. I'm supportive of this as something that should be in the charter. I agree that, you know, one would be horrified to think that we would be engaged in this kind of behavior, but maybe it's happened. I don't know. I'm relatively new. So I would support having this be in the charter. I think it's an appropriate move to make, and I would say that it should be included.
I can hear you what you're saying, and it's not a matter of agreeing or disagreeing. What I'm saying, for the point of clarity, that we asked for it to be expounded upon. But again, as I said, we already know that we don't go to an individual employee in anybody's department, and nor do we direct them to do anything. That's understood, and we know that, and I don't have a problem with it being there. However, the criminal part to it, to try to label it as malfeasance, when again I say to you and everybody up here, if they tell the truth, will tell that employees and residents both come to you to bid on their behalf. So if you're doing it in a professional matter where you might inquire of the city manager, or you might inquire of that department head, or you ask the city manager to inquire of that department head about the issue. And again, I have no problem with it. The trying to make it something of a criminal nature is the part, because you're going to always find yourself between a rock and a hard place, because the residents as well as the employees are going to come to you.
Madam Chair, this specifically sets apart inquiry from interference. So- I'm sorry.
Excuse me, Dr. Hotel, 1 second, please. I'd like to recognize that Chairwoman Tanya Davis Johnson has joined us on the desk at this time.
Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Councilwoman Botel,
Thank you. So this specifically sets apart inquiry from interference, and I agree completely. I, as a matter of routine, have inquiries from members of the public, and I ask and I inquire as to with the city manager, and I ask for information. I routinely do that, but to separate inquiry and information from interference is an important step, I think. So I agree with you, Councilwoman, that it's important for us to continue to be responsive to our citizenry in terms of responding to their inquiries and asking for information. But at the same time, it's important for us to recognize that we shouldn't be interfering with the performance of any employee. Well,
Madam
that's
Chair.
all I'm saying.
Well,
Councilwoman Miller Anderson,
Yes.
recognized.
and I think we're somewhat saying all of the same things, and you, in response to you with the citizens, and I think what's important to understand is they're saying that you're not, from the information you get from the citizens, you don't take that and go directly to the department heads and give them an order.
And I get that.
Right, versus going to the city manager and asking that she handles it. This is stating if you go directly to the staff and tell them what to do, then that's when it will be a problem. But as long as you're listening to the constituents, taking their information and inquiring about it and getting to the city manager and then making sure that she follows through on it, and we're holding her accountable for doing something about it versus us going directly to the department heads or the staff that are who is involving. I think that's the difference.
Yeah, and I stated that exactly that we want the city manager to do her bidding or her inquiry of the department heads. But I think just trying to add, because you're going to have to determine, and it's going to be left up to each of us to determine whether or not we're inquiring for informational purposes, or just because you asked a question, someone come back and say you gave a directive or something like that. There's too much play left in it to say that we will label that as malfeasance, because it's going to be left up to one determination: who tells the story. Was that an inquiry for informational purpose, or was the chair or was the councilwoman trying to give a directive, or did she just merely ask a question in passing? Did the mayor say go off and do so and so because he asked about the house that's demolished? When he say, hey, Public Works, when are y'all gonna take that house down on 29th Street or whatever? Doesn't mean he said go and take it down. It's just an inquiry for information. But if someone was to come back and say, oh, he told us to go ahead and get that taken down, that's why I say there's too much play to charge someone with malfeasance.
Coming
this
in,
instance.
coming in on the tail end of the discussion, I am not in opposition because we have to be very honest and frank about what has been happening around the city of Revere Beach as it relates to the legislative body interfering in the day-to-day operations and giving direction to staff. That is not something that is totally unheard of and not something that has happened in the course of this government being in action. We need to have a definitive non-interference clause, making it expressly the responsibility of this legislative body to talk to the city manager and the city manager only, because the city manager directs all other staff. We can say that, you know, we want to be able to distinguish between inquiry and directive, but we know what an inquiry is and we know what a directive is, and we have given directives to staff. That has happened. That is not something that we can sit here and dismiss as if it's never happened in the history of this city. So this particular clause for me, there has to be some sort of penalty in place, in my opinion, because if there isn't, there will be the continued just disregard of the city manager in his or her capacity, and the board just moving forward to direct staff to complete a task or to do whatever it is that is being directed by a city council person. So if it's not misfeasance, then what would be the other potential consequence that could come as a result of interference by the legislative body with the city manager's obligation as the CEO of the city?
Well,
Can you answer that question for me, sir?
Right, and that, we could certainly clarify that to make it clear that if there is a perceived problem, the council members need to go through the city manager, not directly to the staff. I don't know if you wanted to have a back and forth dialogue. Certain members of our board may want to contribute, or if you want to do that after all the items are done, whatever you prefer.
Can we just take 5 minutes, please? Can,
one minute.
here's what can we just take 5 minutes and put a table here? To have them sitting disjointed just is counterproductive to this experience, and typically when we have a workshop, they are usually there.
Thank you.
5-minute recess, please. The joint workshop will now resume.
Thank you very much. I think what I'd like to do, we've gone over briefly item 1. I'd like to just briefly go over items 2 through 8, and then at that time, if we could engage in a dialogue perhaps between the council and the members of the board, if that would be satisfactory with the chair and council.
We agree?
Madam Chair, I did have.
Council members? I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor?
No, I just had a question, clarification on the last point that Councilwoman Hubbard made.
One moment. Is that the pleasure of the council? We can go through the items and then ask questions at the end?
Yeah,
We can
had
change it, yeah.
decided
Okay.
that we were gonna do it
At the request of the attorney,
after each.
after each one?
Right, but since you're on number 1, before you go to number 2, I'd just like to finish that.
Sure.
While I know that we have up there in the first sentence, except for purposes of inquiry and information, we individually know what that means, inquiry and information. But as I said, one may interpret it differently, be it a resident or be it a employee that asks you. I don't know if any of my colleagues make a habit of giving directives to the employees. That's not something that I do. I might ask a lot of questions, and I might try to get a lot of information and discuss it with the city manager to get to the bottom of it. But again, because it leaves for the interpretation of you and I in the stairwell in passing, and I merely ask you a question, and you say that I gave you a directive. Now I'm being labeled as committing malfeasance. So that is the only part that I have a problem with. Putting it in the ordinance, making it clear and plain, but anything that's left up to someone's interpretation is, you go and he say, she say, who are we going to believe? The lying, corrupt council person, or are we going to believe the other person who's made the allegation? So that's the part that that I have a problem with. It's not a habit that I have, so that's not why I have a problem with it. I'm just trying to show what how the average mind, or what could happen to someone.
Madam Chair,
Mr. Mayor, you recognize?
thank you. My concerns are numerous. One is we already have in play that if a council member does anything that's illegal or whatever, the council has the right to bring an action, whether it's censure, whether it's reprimand, or whatever. That's already in the charter, that the council can do certain things. I like that because it is not punitive as far as criminal. To have something criminal and criminal enforcement, I think, is overstepping the boundary because of so much ambiguity here. Sure, the lawyer could tell you, either lawyer, but when you're dealing with a crime, you want to deal with intent. Also, evidence. Because someone said that you gave him an order or interfered in a directive doesn't necessarily mean that you did. If you don't have anything in writing to substantiate that, then it becomes your word. No, I didn't do that. I never told that person that. Then who do you believe is what Councilman Hubbard said. So the facts could be construed as to one versus the other. There isn't any proof of it. And I would rather see something in writing, because anybody can say anything. He interfered or she interfered. And then to have that any one of us can be criminally prosecuted for something that we have no proof of. And you can't say who did what, because the word is just your word. Somebody said she did or he did. How do you know?
Madam
How
Chair.
can you prove that? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councilwoman Miller Anderson, you recognize?
So maybe if one of the attorneys can answer, what is the process? How do you determine if someone did interfere? I mean, what type of evidence, or, I mean, I know it's just not based on she said, he
Right, it
said.
would have to be some concrete evidence, and the way this provision refers to Florida Statute 112.51, it's really not a criminal matter, it's a matter if it's serious enough, evidence could be provided to the governor, whoever that may be, and the governor could commence to suspend or remove the person for malfeasance. I believe Vice Chairman Ferguson wanted to give a little input on this. Is that correct, Mr.
I
Vice
did, but
Chairman?
you've
Did I
already
cover it?
addressed my issue.
Okay,
It's not,
thank you.
it's not a criminal act.
Not a
so
crime,
when
right.
you think of malfeasance and misfeasance in those terms, I was just confirming,
Not a
there is
crime.
no criminal statute that
Correct.
addresses misfeasance or malfeasance.
That's
So
correct.
the board should not be worried about that issue.
So is it civil?
Excuse me?
Is it
Right,
civil?
it's a
then?
proceeding, like, for example, there've been in times in the past when the governor has suspended certain officials for malfeasance. If I can proceed on to the number two with this.
Well, let's just flesh that out
Yeah.
before we proceed.
Thank
I
you.
do understand our need to get through it, but we've already
That's fine.
traveled down this rabbit hole, so let's
Okay.
finish it and then we can
Agreed.
move on in case there's some further
Thank you.
questions.
I believe our secretary from the board, Mr. Guy Despino, would like to give a little brief comment, if he may.
Mr. Despino, you recognize? Pull your microphone to you, please, sir.
Yeah, I think we shared some of the concerns you had. I think one of the things that was discussed is specifically articulating not only a responsibility, probably a duty of council people to ask questions of their constituents. That's reasonable, and we felt this did that. Forgetting the intent, but I just want to say that the intent in the discussion was to clarify and codify, which I don't see in the charter anyplace, your responsibilities and duties to actually ask questions for your constituents, because that's not specifically stated.
Chair Pro Tem, you recognize?
I think Mr. Ferguson was about to say something else.
Yes. I wasn't actually at this meeting, because if I had, I probably would have taken exception to it the way it's presented. But in any event, firstly, to address Councilman Hubbard's concern, malfeasance, and Mayor Masters also, you stated malfeasance. There is no criminal statute that identifies what malfeasance is. I am going to assume that what constitutes malfeasance is based on, if you will, administrative case law. It may be civil case law. Our counsel and Mr. DeGraffenreich can speak more intelligently on that. As far as that goes, as far as having a codified inside of the charter, my thought at least, that is your affirmative duty to have an open ear to your constituents, and that's a little extra to me. I think that goes without saying. But, you know, this is what we have here. But the major issue that I thought I heard was concern about possibly being brought under some sort of criminal investigation. And my interpretation of this, and I've not heard anyone else as far as our counsel speak contrary to this, is that this does not open you up in and of itself to some sort of criminal act. So the statute that should be referenced, a section of the Florida Constitution, talks about a number of different issues on which a governor may suspend you if you commit a criminal offense, whether it be felony or misdemeanor, malfeasance, misfeasance. There are many other things that are enumerated inside of the Constitution, and I do think they're also codified in that statute. But again, malfeasance itself is not actually identified. So you're not going to get a specific definition that's going to allay any concerns you may have about a prospective city resident trying to trump up some charges, if you will, that you have committed malfeasance or misfeasance. It's not criminal. It will be handled in the administrative sector or the civil sector. So that's my assessment.
I have a question. How does this, because this specifically says proposed amendment to create non-interference clause between legislative and administrative branches. How does that factor in a constituent or a citizen calling in a legislative member of this council to express concerns, to ask questions? We are strictly talking about legislative and administrative. It doesn't address constituents, and I don't understand how we're bringing that into this picture. Just about all municipalities have a non-interference clause, because in whatever form of government, if you have elected officials and you have a city manager, county administrator form of government, it is that administrator or city manager's responsibility to handle their staff. it is not our place, nor is it a part of our elected duty to go to staff. So I'm trying to understand how we melded in the public into this when this is specifically creating the non-interference clause between legislative and administrative.
Madam
So
Chair.
can someone enlighten me on that? Chair
Yeah.
Pro Tem, you recognize?
And I think we all agree that none of us should be, and that this is a part of most cities and most government bodies, that if you have this form of government, that the administrative happens to direct the day-to-day duties. Again, my concern is with the malfeasance, because it might not be criminal. It's still just as damning having the governor cite you or reprimand you because of this. And by it being so unclear and it's left up to interpretation, so let's say if it's the city manager and the council person, you talking to her or you're inquiring, and say he then determines that you were telling him what to do, as opposed to you're in there having a meeting. That's one thing. So anything can come of it. That's why I say it's just too much play left in it for it to be. You can say the city manager, you can say the employee, you know, or the department head, whatever you want to substitute in there that would have one tell you that the governor can now say that you've committed malfeasance. And that's not something that you might not go to jail for it, but you know you don't want to have that someone state that and the governor reprimand you for something that no one can prove one way or the other.
Madam Chair.
Is there an alternate provision that could be placed? What is another consequence for a violation of the non-interference clause if it is not determined, if we don't want to use the term malfeasance? Is there another action that can be employed?
We can look into, Madam Chairwoman, we could certainly look into creating a different form of sanction. Okay. And we can, I can work with the board on that and develop it further if necessary.
Councilwoman Botel, you recognize?
Well, isn't there some due process involved here? I mean, we wouldn't just hang someone by the thumbs in the lobby. We'd be looking into it. We'd be checking the allegation. We'd be investigating it. It wouldn't be automatically assumed that one was guilty because someone made an accusation. I mean, this is...
Sure we would.
No,
we've
we
been doing
wouldn't.
that. We've been doing that for the last 6 or 7 months without any proof, with all allegations that have been made back and forth. So sure we would. So I wouldn't, so that's why I'm clear that something needs to be a little clearer.
Well, I disagree.
Madam Chairwoman, should I proceed to the second item at this time?
You should, sir.
Just as I emphasized at the beginning, these are the proposed recommendations
Absolutely.
of the board, and no final recommendations have yet been made.
Thank you, sir.
Item 2, and also Board Member Clark has joined us. Appreciate that. Thank you. Proposed amendment to provide the term limits is the next one. Proposed amendment to provide term limits for the elected body. This would be new charter text, which if included in items presented to the voters and approved by the voters would provide that no individual shall be elected to the office of city council member for more than 3 consecutive terms, irrespective of the district for which the individual is elected to serve. No individual shall be elected to serve as mayor for more than 3 consecutive terms. If a council member or a mayor already has served 3 terms upon the adoption of this charter amendment, that official shall be permitted to serve 1 additional term. I don't know if you have any questions at this point, or if I should proceed to the next item, subject to dialogue when we complete the items, whatever the preference of the chair and council. Should I proceed?
Proceed.
Item 3 is a proposed amendment to provide a procedure for suspension and termination of a city manager. Right now, a procedure is not provided for in the charter, so this, if approved by the voters and placed by the council on the ballot, this would create new charter text that would read, "The city manager may be suspended by a resolution approved by the majority of the total membership of the city council, which shall set forth the reasons for suspension and proposed removal. A copy of such resolution shall be served within 1 business day upon the city manager. The city manager shall have 7 days in which to reply thereto in writing, and upon request shall be afforded a public hearing, which shall occur not earlier than 10 days nor later than 15 days after such hearing is requested. After the public hearing, if one is requested, and after full consideration, the city council, by the supermajority vote of its total membership, which in this case would mean 4 affirmative votes, may adopt a final resolution of removal. The city manager shall continue to receive full salary until the effective date of a final resolution of removal." This would create a process for considering any suspension or removal or termination of the city manager, and would afford a due process public hearing. I can proceed to the next one, if it please the chair. Next is item 4, proposed amendment to sections 4 and 5 of Article 2 to provide for the elimination of the second runoff election and to create a procedure to resolve tie votes at a runoff election. This is a lengthy provision, which you see on your screen and in your materials, so I won't read it verbatim. However, I'd like to explain what it does. The most important thing it does is get rid of the unusual provision in the charter that provides for a second runoff election. The Palm Beach County Supervisor of Elections visited the charter board about a month ago. Actually, she didn't visit the board. She couldn't make it for certain important reasons, but she sent a email which explained that she cannot be running or doing a second runoff election. She has no problem with doing one runoff election if no candidate gets a majority vote in the first election, but she cannot be doing a double runoff election because of cost, expense, and other factors. And it is very unusual, the charter provision having the potential of a double runoff. The double runoff apparently occurred a few years ago, or a couple years ago back here, when 2 people had the exact same amount of votes in the first runoff election. What this would do, it would provide that if nobody gets a majority of votes in the first regular election, then the 2 top vote getters would proceed to the runoff election. However, if a tie vote occurred at that runoff election, the tie vote would be broken and determined by the drawing of lots under the supervision of the city clerk. And this charter provision provides the specific procedure for that, and we obtained the valuable input of the city clerk on this. And basically that procedure provides that in the event of a tie vote at the runoff election held in accordance with section 4 above, the final outcome shall be determined in public by the drawing of lots under the supervision of the city clerk. The specific procedure which is to be utilized for the drawing of lots shall be as follows. The name of each candidate who has tied shall be placed on a separate piece of paper, which shall be placed in an opaque container so that the candidates' names are not visible. The city clerk shall then reach into the container and randomly select one piece of paper from the container. The candidate whose name appears on that piece of paper shall be declared elected. This procedure would only be used at the runoff election, and it's not unusual to have a procedure for drawing of lots in tie votes under state law. And this would have the important effect of, if approved by the voters, removing the potential for a costly second runoff election, because when a second runoff is held, that's additional cost to the taxpayers of the city. May I proceed to the next one at this time? Thank you. Item number 5 is a proposed amendment to section 15 of Article 2 to delete the mayor's authority to suspend city officers and employees. This provision, if placed before the voters and if adopted by the voters, would amend Section 15 to strike out the language which is shown on the slide and in the materials. That language that would be removed from the charter concerns the mayor's power to suspend officers. The language that would be deleted, if approved by the voters, is the following. The mayor shall have the power to suspend any officer or employee of the city, except members of the council, for misconduct in office or neglect of duty, but shall report his or her action in writing to the council with reasons therefore at the next regular meeting of the council for its approval or disapproval, and the said officer or employee shall stand and remain suspended only upon the approval thereof by a majority vote of the council, and upon disapproval thereby shall receive his or her compensation for the time during which he or she was suspended. The deletion of this language was proposed and presented to the electors at the March 11th, 2008 election, approximately 10 years ago, and as the mayor pointed out earlier, that proposed charter amendment was rejected by the voters. May I proceed to item 6 at this time? Item 6 is a proposed amendment of the city charter, Article 2, to create a new section that would be entitled Restriction on Former Elected City Officials. It would create a section 25 entitled Restriction on Former Elected City Officials, and that new section, if placed on the ballot and approved by the voters, would read, no former elected city official shall hold any compensative, appointive city office or employment until 1 year after the expiration of his or her term of office. So it would create a time restriction on former office holders from being employed by the city. May I proceed to the next item? Next is item 7, proposed amendment of City Charter Article 7 to create a new Section 8 entitled Conflict of Interest Ethical Standards. This new section, if placed on the ballot and approved by the voters, would create a Section 8 Conflicts of Interest Ethical Standards, and it would read as follows. The mayor and council members and all officers and employees of the city shall be subject to the standards of conduct for public officers and employees set by federal, state, county, or other applicable law. The city council may adopt additional standards of conduct and code of ethics requirements that are consistent with federal, state, county, or other applicable law. This would be a provision that is commonly found in several other city charters. May I proceed to the final one, item 8? Thank you. The item 8 is a proposed amendment of City Charter Article 2, Section 18, entitled Removal of Officers and Employees, to delete requirement that the city manager needs justifiable cause to remove city officers and department heads. If this item is placed on the ballot and approved by the electors, it would remove and delete and repeal paragraph B of Section 18 of the city charter, and that paragraph B that would be repealed presently states as follows. The city manager shall have the power to appoint and remove any city officer or head of a department except for the city attorney. However, the city manager shall have the power to remove any such city officer or head of a department only for justifiable cause. The city council may, by ordinance, define the term justifiable cause as used herein. That particular charter provision, which is proposed to be repealed, had been created in the 2008 charter amendment election. At this time, we'd be happy to answer any questions and also to welcome any dialogue between the council members and the members of the advisory board. Thank you all for your interest and attention and for your input.
Madam Chair?
Chair Pro Tem, you recognize?
We can start right here with this one. I was here when you did the 2008 charter review. Now, I think that we must have justifiable cause or a reason, but not that I think that any city manager, well, would just up and fire someone without, without a reason. And to take out the term justifiable cause is a problem, because we have a civil service board now also that the person would be able to avail themselves of. But why did we want to take out justifiable cause? Are we promoting that type of behavior, or do we feel that it's fair to do that?
If I can answer that, the purpose is to remove this because this clause only applies to the power to remove any city officer
Sir,
or head.
excuse me for interrupting. Would you just place your mic a little closer to
Yes,
me, please?
thank you.
Thank
This particular clause refers to the power of the manager to remove a city officer, which, for example, could be a police officer or a head of a department. So the thinking was the bulk of the employees still remain protected by the civil service protection. But the thinking of the board was it's important for a manager when they come in to be able to build their own team of people that they trust in the high department level positions. So that was the discussion and debate held at the board when they tentatively approved this provision. There was a feeling it was important to, when a manager comes in, they should be comfortable and have their own team of department heads. That was the thinking of it, and the board members may well have something to add to that if desired.
I hear you, and I understand the need for a manager to be able to do something like that. What I think is that if a manager comes in and they build their own team with their assistant city managers that they have. If you're working with these department heads and you have to evaluate them, see, that's a problem we have here in the city. Evaluations aren't done on a regular basis. If you evaluate those department heads and you're monitoring their work and their behavior, then if you choose not to give them good points or give them good grades and you get to that point, but to just automatically come in the door and just start to remove people, it makes, it doesn't make for a comfortable work environment, and I think it sends the wrong message. That's just my 2 cents.
Do we not have a progressive set of merit rules that outline infractions and the consequences to those infractions, which ultimately, if the infraction is egregious, we could certainly move for immediate termination. And then if there is a written reprimand, after the written reprimand comes the 3 to 5 day suspension and that would be for a second offense. For a third offense, you could take it as far as you wish to take it, but I don't know that we need to. You can remove the word justifiable and use it in your progressive disciplinary action process that ultimately gets you to the justified reason, because you're going to have documentation that's going to show the infractions, the consequence, and I think it's up to the third offense or possibly the fourth offense. It ends with termination depending upon the infraction. I'm not opposed to justifiable cause, because you should be developing your trail that supports the justification for any such termination. Mr. Ferguson.
Madam Chair, I think the board thought that I use the term, is that section's just sitting there like an appendix. It has no functional use. It's been on the books since 2008, but it still has not been defined, justifiable cause, that is. Furthermore, to have the level of specificity that I think I've heard now on several occasions in this last hour put into the charter would potentially make the charter, or more importantly, the city business, kind of get bogged down, if you will. My understanding is that those type of things that the chair was just addressing would be better served in terms of a resolution better addressed in terms of an ordinance or even an employee manual. It wouldn't be the proper.
That's where I'm suggesting that it is. I'm not
Right.
suggesting that it go there.
Right, so this is just saying removing the part about justifiable cause because we're all at will, well, the city employees are. So we thought that having that term there, justifiable cause, was superfluous, if you will. And particularly since it's never been defined in 10 years, the likelihood is that it probably wouldn't be defined moving forward, so just remove it. And if, as you stated, Madam Chair, there are already certain protocols and procedures in place that any city manager is supposed to follow, then so be it. We're trying to kind of cull the fat, if you will, from the charter. There are a lot of redundant things, there are a lot of ambiguous things that are bogging you all down as policymakers. So our goal really is just trying to free you all up to do what you need to do. We have confidence that you and future board members will adhere to the rules of the law of the land. So we're just trying to kind of get this confusion out of your way. That was the intent to removing that.
I certainly appreciate that, and that's why I'm simply saying, I said that to say that the removal of justifiable is not a concern of mine because there should be measures in place that get you to justification. Dr. Spaniel.
In fairness, I think Ms. Hubbard had a point about the, Civil Review Board, Civil Service Review Board, and that would deal with other employees. This really was specifically on managers and department heads, where being in line with the city manager was thought to be really important. From a philosophical perspective, from a technological perspective, a little bit different than some of the concerns you raised, really specifically to department heads and managers. I don't know if that makes you feel more comfortable, but I just wanted to.
I appreciate you elaborating on that. The reason we might not have to expound on the word justifiable in this particular paragraph, but I still think that justifiable, you can't legislate, anybody's conscience, but at least it tells one that your decision, it has to be justifiable, and it behooves you to create this track, and it creates you to create the documentation needed to substantiate that this was actually justifiable. We don't have to elaborate or lay out all the things that one would take and consider justifiable, but I think for all fairness and for all honesty, we should at least have the word justifiable cause within there.
But why though?
Because one would have to lay that, it would say to you that you would have to justify your reason for getting rid of the department head, not because you walked in and decided you didn't like the color of his tie that day.
Unless a person has been fired for a discriminatory reason, race, sexual orientation, those type of things, they're all at will anyway. Right. So this is just making things more cumbersome to have that word justifiable in there. Moreover, since no one has taken the time in the last 10 years to define it, just remove it. Again, it's analogous to an appendix. It's just there. It has no functional use. Justifiable cause means nothing. And there are already federal, state, and I don't know if there's city rules, but it's definitely federal and state that kind of limit what can and can't be done, the manner in which a person can be fired. So if I want to fire you, Ms. Hubbard, say you were my department head and I wanted to fire you solely because you're a woman or because of your race, there are going to be consequences. We don't need to codify that in a charter.
No,
and so, again, it has no legal effect, so just remove it. All it can do is serve to confuse, just like many other sections in the charter have done to this board and boards before in years past.
Madam Chair,
Councilwoman Botelho,
could I just ask what are the provisions of Article 3 of this charter to which this refers?
Excuse me, Article 3, that's the civil service provisions of the charter.
Okay, thank you. Which doesn't really come into play if we're talking about managers. Right, thank you.
Any further questions or comments on item number 8? We seem to be Is there any comment on item number 2, proposed term limits? Any comments or questions about that issue?
My only comment about the proposed term limits is that, it went before the public before, and that wasn't something that, people were really willing to embrace at that time. Whether there's a stronger palette for it right now, I would venture to say, and still, an election is an election. Once people are done with you, they no longer vote for you, and you're no longer up here anyway. So, in speaking of, redundancy or just being there, you are taking away the option from persons is what this turns out to be. And that's just that would be just my input on it.
Any other comments on that? Number 3, proposed amendment to provide procedure for suspension and termination of a city manager. I have a question for you all. Where in government practices and best practices is this type of provision provided for?
From my municipal work, I'm familiar that a similar provision is in the Aventura City Charter and in the Cooper City Charter, just by example, that before a manager is terminated, they have a chance to be heard. But it's not in every charter, but it is in some.
I think that
You recognize Chair Pro Tem?
that's all right. He wants to go first. I'll
No,
let
that's
him
good.
go. No, you go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I don't want you to think that necessarily just because you get a proposal from us, then that doesn't necessarily mean we were unanimous. If you read our minutes, I think you'll see there was some discussion in this matter. There are different provisions regarding this particular issue. I mean, some cities actually have a supermajority to hire and a majority to terminate. So I think there was dialogue, and I think this is one of the things some of us wanted to hear your input.
What else?
Comments?
Madam Chair?
Chair Pro Tem, you recognized?
What I was going to say is that while I remember a couple things I wanted to say. I remember during the time when we dismissed our former city manager. The town of Palm Beach stated in the Palm Beach Post, we are not going to discuss or negotiate our personnel matters in public. And they appointed their new city manager without ceremony. We are protecting, we're willing here to give protection to the city manager, but we don't seem to see why a department head would want the same or something remotely similar as a justifiable cause of being terminated. They don't have half the protection that a city manager has with a contract with a severance package. They don't have that level of protection, but we want to debate and have a public hearing, which blows my mind, about the removal of a city manager, as opposed, but yet we are not willing to give a fair. We're not willing to push forth that a department head would have to have justifiable cause to be let go, or because a new city manager arrives and he wants to clear the department heads, poof, they're gone. But yet, we've got to go through a public hearing, we've got a contract, we've got all this for that person. It just seems, how can you swallow one, but you can't digest the other? That's what I see the difference being in both.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Ferguson, you recognize?
That definitely is an issue that we spoke about, Pro Tem Hubbard, but I think one would admit that the city manager is the most important employee in the city. He or she is the CEO, if you will, of the city. Without that person in that executive position, a lot of things kind of linger. We can think about what's happened with our water. There are many things that have happened arguably because we haven't had a city manager in place. As far as that goes, furthermore, if you think about it from a business standpoint, do you really want to give every single employee or department head this same level of procedure in terms of that? If you just think about it from that standpoint. Now, you mentioned that there's a contract. Of course, there's a contract in place, but particularly for this city and probably Aventura, when I researched them, there's been a history of kind of this uncertainty or this disruption of the city business due to the fact that the city manager is always kind of halfway sitting with a foot out of the door. So, okay, fine. If you put that city manager in, then basically what it's saying is you darn well better be sure that this person is not good for the city before you throw them out. Because every time you throw a city manager out, historically in Riviera Beach, city business stops, or it definitely slows down to the detriment of the citizens. That's the major difference between a city manager and a department head. With all due respect to our department heads who may be watching, the city manager is that person that we need to make sure is efficient and able to carry out their jobs proficiently. Because if you all are keeping track of the city managers moving forward, then there won't be these issues. So all that I'm hearing in that presentation is that, okay, fine, we say we want to get rid of the city manager for whatever, malfeasance, misfeasance, whatever feasance we want to use, active omission or commission, whatever the case may be, fine. All we're saying is within a short period of time, let's bring it out before the group.
Let me interject right here.
And say what it is, what's the basis for the termination.
Chair Pro Tem, you recommend?
Let me make a point here. One, first of all, we got to establish the fact that we're not talking about the importance of one's job. Everybody's job is important. We have that's a given. We know that the city managers are the head of the ship, and it's very important that they have the capability to steer. And I think when we all vote to elect one or to hire one, we feel that we have done our best to choose the right person and to bring the right person aboard. That's even still with a department head. I'm sure the managers that chose that department head felt that they had done their very best to choose the right applicant for that job. I don't want to say I'm not willing to say because you are not the most important person here at the city of Riviera Beach, your rights should be trampled over. You're not really going to the Civil Service Board. Why? Because you are a department head. So now we're just saying if the city manager don't care for the way you performed, you thought you heard her instruction or his instructions perfectly, and that didn't and it didn't translate into what you actually did, then you're out of the door without question. So you don't want that for anybody. You're saying you don't want that for the city manager, and you're saying and I don't want it for the department heads. I'm not saying that the department heads are one being mistreated or done wrong in the city. I want to be real clear with that. That's not why we're having this discussion. We're having this discussion because this item and these two examples are being put before us. And I'm just saying, just for argument and example's sake, when you put these two items in here that contradict each other as to what you're willing to do for one and what you're not willing to do for the other, I think that there's a problem with that. And I think that that needs to be looked at again, what you would, and nor am I saying that these things need to be provided for the city department heads. I am not saying have that. What I'm saying is there needs to be a justifiable, documented reason for letting them go.
So, Madam Chair, may I please briefly? So again, I thought I heard Madam Chair state that there are already protocols in place in terms of if I want to remove a department head, in terms of the write-ups and things of that nature.
It was in the form of a question. I was asking if we have that type of merit rule process.
I wouldn't know that.
I wasn't asking you. I was talking to the city manager when I asked that question.
Okay. Do we have those?
Madam Chair, there is a policy on discipline and control that the first offense, you receive a verbal warning, verbal written warning. Second offense, you receive a written warning. Third offense, suspension up to a day or up to however many days. And then the fourth, I believe, is termination.
Okay. Again, the city manager, without the appropriate party steering the ship, the city is going to kind of be listless. So I think it is important to make sure that before this person be sent out to Harbor, because then we obviously have other areas of the charter which we haven't addressed as far as the protocol deadline by which a new city manager has to put in place. We've all been it for the past 6 years. Every time a city manager has been removed, city business has almost come to a complete stop, and we know this. And that's to the detriment of the well-being of the citizens, health-wise, safety-wise, just all around as far as that goes. So basically what it's saying is, look, if you want to get rid of a city manager, simply state your reasons why. And I'll be able to articulate it. That's nothing that any policymaker should find to be odious. Just simply say what it is. This person is not timely. This person is disrespectful. This person does not represent the seal of Riviera Beach properly. Whatever the case may be. And then you all vote, whether it's a 3-2 vote or a 4-1 vote, and be done with it. It's nothing that should linger for a year and two. So this actually speaks to help create a system in place so that future boards don't have to deal with the fiasco that, with all due respect, you all have been dealing with for the past, I guess, 2 years now? But it feels like much longer. Thank you.
Madam Chair, the point is not to have a problem with this item. What I'm saying, how can you feel that because of someone's position, they deserve due process, and the next person, because they are head of the janitorial crew, but they're a department head nonetheless, they don't deserve due process. You're assuming that we have protocols in place that would help them. I know that the manager stated that, but if we don't have it, I don't think if we don't have that in writing, if we didn't have the things that she's speaking of in writing, and you mentioned yourself that we hadn't, justifiable had not been spelled out. So is justifiable spelled out in our policies and procedures for, is there an employee handbook that spells this out? Is there a resolution? Is there an ordinance? But to give somebody carte blanche without them, just the mere fact that they thought that they had to have a justifiable cause might have exuded a little bit more fairness in dealing with people.
But you already have a civil review board. That's what I'm saying. This is not
You just said they can't go to civil review board because they're department heads.
So the department heads, no, but again, remember, think about keep this in context. Don't just get focused on the amendment. That's the thing we struggle with at our meetings, quite frankly. We get focused on the amendment, but they can't see the forest because of the tree. What's the actual effect to the city, whether good or bad, by having something like this in place? The goal is to keep the city business moving forward. So again, if you have a contract for a city manager that's supposed to last for a year or two, unless there's an extreme situation as I define it would be a 4-1 vote or a 3-2 vote if the 4-1 amendment is not passed by the electorate, then that person continues on to the end of their contract. Make sure that, so basically what it's saying for the board is just make sure that you properly vet these people before you put them in the seat. But once you put them in there, we don't want to just arbitrarily have to get a new city manager once or twice every 2 or 3 years. So again, stand before the board.
But you do keep in, I need to interrupt you because you have to keep in mind that any person that accepts a city manager position understands that on any given day, they can be let go of for a reason that they could no longer be a fit. So I'm trying to understand how we get to going into, with a CEO type position, if you will. CEOs aren't given a resolution to talk about the reasons why we wish to terminate you or we wish to suspend you. It is either a suspension or it's a termination. And that is what is, in my mind, best practices and what happens not only in private sector, but in public sector. And so to introduce a resolution form of disciplinary action for a city manager, I think that is cumbersome, and that presents this other opportunity. Now, if we want to say after a board member or the body decides to terminate and they want to give an opportunity for that public hearing so that the person can go on record, then perhaps that's an opportunity that should be afforded. But to enter into or to even bring about a process of going into a resolution in order to have a disciplinary action, to me, is adding an additional layer that shouldn't be there. Dr.
Look at the
Spino,
window of time.
one moment, Dr.
Yes, ma'am.
Spino, please.
Yeah, I think this is one of the areas where, again, I have to apologize for my ignorance to this type of government structure, first of all. I'm not used to weak mayor, and I'm used to a stronger mayor as the chief executive, not as a. So I think you have a philosophical issue to address as a city council. If you want your city manager to have very strong authority, even stronger than a CEO, because a CEO is usually terminated by a majority of the board, not by a supermajority of the board in most public companies. This is requiring a supermajority, 4 out of 5, and I could see all kinds of problems with that. So again, I think this is something that the city needs to wrestle with. But in fairness, I think the board was struggling, and I think any time it comes up, we just had a crisis here. This is the first time I've lived through this, but from what I understand, Riviera Beach is not alone. That other cities have terminated their city managers in a 3-2 vote. It's a common thing. It seems to be about the same tenure as a dean of a business school, maybe a 2-year term, and you're out. That seems to be the case, and other institutions do survive. So I think there are structural issues and philosophical issues that the city council needs to address. However, since we were given a task and a charter, members of the charter review committee felt it's something that they wanted to submit to the voters, and I think that's the issue. But don't assume that we're all in agreement with this and doing a dance for it and think it's great, because some of us don't.
Of course, and this is our opportunity to address what's being proposed, and you still have an opportunity to review, and we have the ultimate vote as to what will go before the electeds. So this is just our opportunity to converse as a board and then to be able to exchange with you all to understand the vantage point from which you presented the information. And so we are not taking this by any stretch of the imagination as the final language. This is just our opportunity to hear from you, and this is not an expansive list of what you will review because you still have additional review to conduct, correct? Okay, so one moment, I do believe, Councilwoman Botel, you had your hand on the mic. Did you have a comment?
No, I'll pass.
Okay. Ms. Clark, you're recognized.
With all due respect, the objective is to look at the last time we went through a charter review process, and it was a lengthy time. So here at our municipality, we are really operating on vagueness, in some cases, repetitiveness, a quandary, and it's just outdated. So we need to look at this and bring this charter up to not only to the year, we're almost in 2019, to now 2019 and beyond. And sitting as a resident and looking at the past scenarios of various city managers, I would ascertain that I had hoped that in their exit process, it would have been followed by the charter. That was not the case. And we need to have the charter tightened up so that if we go through the exits of the city managers, we're following some sort of document methodology process everybody agree on, and one city council or two city council people are interpreting it this way, another group is interpreting it this way, you got the city manager who's interpreting it. We have just been in a quandary of mess, not by the last city manager, but also by the city manager before that person. And I don't know about the city manager before then because I was not here, but sitting here as a resident, it hasn't been consistent. And I'm hoping that this review process, no matter what we're looking at, we're going to find a sense of consistency that's going to outlive your tenure, our tenure, and move us into the future of the next 10, 15, 20 years.
So let me say to each and every one of you, this has been no small feat, no small task. I understand, I mean, I have not sat in a full meeting, but I have sat in 2 of your meetings and heard some of the conversation and the exchange, and I understand that it is a challenge because of the vagueness of the charter, because of how we have operated over the past, let's just say, let's just use the last 20 years. And so we recognize, I believe my colleagues would agree and say that they recognize the challenge that is set before this committee. And we appreciate the time that you are spending, the hours that you have committed to this, the time that you have stepped away from your families in order to review the charter as it exists and seek to tighten it up. So do know that we understand the challenge, and we are not in this moment trying to diminish the work or the recommendations that have come forth. As I said earlier, this is the only opportunity, well, we can come to the meetings, of course, and voice concerns if we have concerns based on what I'm told as it relates to the Sunshine Law and being able to be there. You know, so we get it. Trust me, we get it. And I appreciate, and I will say on behalf of the board, that we appreciate the efforts that have gone into this process thus far. So I don't want you to think that as you are seeking to corral the language and tighten it up and firm it up and make it make sense so that generations to come will have a good, clean document to work from. I want you to know that that is the end goal and that is the desire for having the charter reviewed to begin with, because it was so convoluted and we had so many issues that we faced coming into this particular term or the previous term with council. So I just want to say that I appreciate you, and I just don't want you to think that we are not taking into full consideration that which you are bringing. We're just asking questions about the information as it's being presented. Mr. Ferguson, you recognize.
Mr. Chair, just so we're clear when we go back into our sessions, would the board humor us by show of hands who has an issue with, if this were to become the rule of law in Riviera Beach, who has an issue with affording whoever's the city manager, it looks like no more than 15 days before final determination of termination is decided. Who has an issue with that? I mean, I'm paraphrasing this section, obviously, but effectively that's...
I don't necessarily know that that question is going to be appropriate at this point, because we're listening, they're taking in, and then they're going to... Are you all wanting to make any comments on this?
Madam Chair, I don't have a problem with that.
I don't have a problem with it.
Ms. Hubbard?
I made my point. I just think that if you can address this, you can address the other one. To show fairness to department heads as well, because I'm gonna give everybody the benefit of the doubt. When they get up and they come to work, they're trying to give it their best. It might not be their very best, and it might not work out for the city, but I wanna let them know, you know, that we're gonna give you a fair chance to try to do your best.
Understood.
So let me be clear on this. So you issue a resolution. You're saying that we can suspend by resolution approved by a majority of the board, which will set forth the reasons. And that resolution will be given to them one day before the meeting is to be held?
No, it would be given to, well, you know, the manager, you know, it sometimes happens where suddenly, I've been in some council and commission meetings where suddenly a council member out of the blue, you know, will make a motion to terminate the manager. Well, this would require a resolution be prepared. The resolution could suspend, give the manager a chance to ask for a hearing, and then the council will make the final decision at a hearing. So it basically like it's a due process thing that in a way slows down the process. You know, it gives a time for a second thought. Do we really need to terminate this person in a hostile public environment, or can we work something out? So, but it's, you know, it's for you all to consider, and you don't have to decide tonight whether you like this provision. It's something to think about, and it was recommended by the board, and it creates this mechanism. It gives for example, a city manager might see this charter provision and feel, you know something, I'm happy to come to Riviera Beach. I know I've got some protection besides my potential severance pay. So it may help you bring in certain managers in the future.
Excuse me, Mr. Counsel. Maybe I missed this, but it doesn't just provide a hearing, it provides a hearing and the ratification with a supermajority. Am I correct on that?
It provides, dismissal requires 4 affirmative votes, which is a supermajority, right?
A supermajority,
Right, and then as
Why is-
presently written, it has 4 affirmative votes. You know, you could say, we like this, but like that, just a majority, we don't want the supermajority. But in reading this, I pointed out that it does say supermajority for actual removal, which means 4 affirmative votes, 4 out of 5. So, you know, we appreciate your input. We'd rather see that just a majority vote, and that's fine, and that's the way it'll be.
Because we've seen,
Well-
again, we've seen where boards have had to have a supermajority on the front end, majority on the back end, so we were just saying, okay, fine, majority on the front end, but a supermajority on the back end, and again, particularly with having a historical reference here in Riviera Beach, a lot of, keeping in mind the historical reference at Riviera Beach. I got it, thanks, man. We just think, the majority of the board thinks that's very important because a lot of city business has been stymied in the midst of waiting to get the permanent city manager. That's bad for the citizens. So from that standpoint, we're saying, hey, look, and again, we're just saying present it to the electorate. If they voted in favor of it, great. If they don't, I'm sure you all will continue to do what you've been doing, which is the best for the city. But nevertheless, there has been serious issues over the last three years at minimum, and probably more, to be honest with you, where because we have been uncertain as a city as to who our city manager is, city business has not been getting done. And that's a problem. And you as policymakers, I know you're very concerned about that. This would give us a way to kind of nip it in the bud in a very short period of time, no more than 15 days, I believe. The decision will be made and people can move on. We don't have to become the 11 o'clock lead story on Channel 5, city, and whatever the silly phrase was, which is highly offensive to me. But that was in part due to the fact that we had such an ambiguous provision in our city charter. We're trying to close that ambiguity, allow you all to be what you are been appointed to be, which is policymakers, but also make sure that we're always first and foremost looking after the best interests of the city. Having a city manager, the city manager is the most important singular employee in Riviera Beach. Collectively, obviously, the city manager is not more important than hundreds or thousands of employees we have. But let's be clear, if you have a poor city manager, your city is probably not going to be humming as well as it would otherwise do. So we need to make sure that that city manager has their proper protocols in place to make sure that we're not kind of arbitrarily getting rid of a city manager, because it is to the detriment of the city when we keep shuffling city managers in and out. That's historical. That's not even, that's no criticism of any board member or any city manager, but we want to have our city managers serve for at least 2 to 3 years. Even if they are like the dean of a business college, they still need to be there for that 2 or 3 years. We need that continuity. If they're not effective, then you get rid of them. But don't let it just be arbitrary because of whatever, I don't know.
thank you. Dr. Spignell, you recognize.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate the process issue and the supermajority are 2 different issues, and I believe you can change that because this issue has been depending on who's at our meetings, it's been a 3 to 4 vote almost every time. So let's be clear on that.
All right, Madam.
Chair Pro Tem, you recognize? You recognize Chair Pro Tem?
This is an unusual situation, I think, that our city has been in the last year. I think that a lot of times while we have not always been able to get everything done or progress made as far as redevelopment and moving the city in those particular directions, that didn't necessarily happen on the city side. I agree 200% that if you don't have a good city manager that can run the city and understand the operation of the city, we won't be able to do a good job for the people or for the city at large. But I'm not. When you say arbitrarily let go of a city manager, in my mind, this is being crafted just so because of a certain situation, not because it would be a global fix, if you will, for the future of the city of Riviera Beach. So when we talk about having when I still struggle with someone arbitrarily, letting anybody go. Somebody arbitrarily letting the city manager or the department heads go. I think there just have to be some justifiable cause either way. And that's what I'm saying. Just out of pure fairness. That's all I'm saying. Just out of pure fairness, the bottom line, treat people the way you want to be treated. You wouldn't have, if you were a city manager or a department head, you wouldn't want that. And that's all I'm trying to say about that. And because I don't think that's where our bargain, I know it has a lot to do with it in this situation. It was kind of unusual this year with our city manager situation. A lot of it was, created and deliberately, manufactured. But we find ourselves where we are. But this fix, I think, is for that situation, not for a global effect. Miss Anita, you don't want to join us up front?
Item number 4, please. Are there any comments on the provision to remove, or do we want to sit with this document, give them an opportunity to revisit and come back with additional comments, or do we wish to continue on?
I mean, we're almost done. We'll have a couple more to go.
Okay. Are there any comments for the provision with removing the second runoff provision?
Madam Chair.
Councilwoman Miller Anderson, you recognize?
I don't have an issue with the procedure, only with the exception of the pulling of the names
The lots,
and
casting
lots.
of lots?
That I just think is something from back in 1900, 1700.
Believe it or
And
not, there's something that's still
I
in
know
place.
that.
Do you
I
know
that, but I just still think that is so. That
can't.
yes, I have to think of other suggestions on how that may be.
on casting that?
Yeah, but I definitely agree with how much money that it takes to do these elections. So I'm in agreement with the process, except for that one little piece.
Madam Chair,
Chair Pro Tem.
Councilperson Anderson, yes, we had that same sentiment exactly, because in some instances it was a flipping of a coin, or how a most recent, I believe, congressperson was elected on the East Coast, and it was pulling the long straw or the short straw. So we looked at best practices in other municipalities to come up with not a Fred Flintstone type of scenario. And so hopefully this will do it.
Madam Chair.
Chair Pro Tem, you recognize?
I want to inquire of the clerk, if we needed a second runoff, would the municipality be able to host that themselves, or they would still have to go through the supervisor of election? No, the question is, would we be allowed to host the second runoff ourselves, or would we have to employ the services of the supervisor of election for the second runoff?
The services of the supervisor of elections would have to be employed.
Okay. Yes, and as we pay her to host, our elections, and we pay her, for her services. I was just wondering, since we weren't on a full ballot of items, if we went into this smaller scenario, would that be something that a municipality is allowed to host themselves? That was what I was wondering.
If you recall, when we had the tie vote in 2016. The town of Palm Beach was going through a similar situation, wherein the date in which they were holding their election, and they ended up having to go with on the ballot with everyone else during that presidential primary, because they were not able to host their own. Because what ends up happening, in order to stay in compliance with state statute, you would basically have to put out a bid for someone who's going to calculate your ballots, who's going to provide the machines, who's going to certify, all of that stuff. And what the town of Palm Beach found out was that there was no one willing to do such a thing, to be involved in the political arena on that level.
My question, thank you. Yeah,
Okay.
I was just wondering, was that something outside of pulling straws and flipping corns and counting how many jelly beans are in that jar or something of that nature? Thank you.
I would venture to say that we all feel same way as it relates to the manner by which we ultimately break the tie. Number 5. This is the article to proposed amendment to delete the mayor's authority to suspend city officers and employees. Comments from the board?
Madam Chair.
Chair,
Right.
Councilwoman Miller
See,
Anderson,
now you're trying to do it.
trying to give it to you.
And this is probably for the other items. I think there were a couple other items that they mentioned had been brought up before, where they came to the ballot and they voted it down. Was any of that taken in consideration, or you just felt there was a reason to bring it back up, or how did that come about?
My understanding, and the board could address this, the reason they proposed this, even though the voters rejected this change 10 years ago, was that they felt by taking away this unique power of the mayor, it helped to build up the power of the manager, enhance the manager's control over officers and employees of the city. That's my understanding, although the board members could certainly add to that.
Do you find from any of the research that you all have done, have you noticed where this really only lies with strong mayors? Or are there situations where there is a ceremonial mayor that has this power as well? Is this unique in our charter?
My understanding is that this is unique in the Riviera Beach Charter with the particular system. Doesn't mean it's wrong,
Right,
but it
right.
means it is unique. The con to it is that it could interfere with the manager's abilities and powers. The pro, if you have to formulate a pro for keeping the provision, is that it could create a safeguard for the speedy suspension of a troublesome officer or employee. The mayor doesn't have the power to remove, only suspend, and then the suspension is heard by the council. But it was 10 years ago that this was rejected, so the board felt it was appropriate to take another look at it. But, the board could add to that if desired.
Okay, thanks.
I think the Secretary Despino has a comment.
Yeah,
on
I
that.
think there was some confusion among some of us at the last meeting on that vote. Some of us thought we were voting to keep it as it is after the mayor's presentation about checks and balances. So that's something some of us may want to revisit.
Madam Chair.
Chair Pro Tem, you recognize?
I think for that reason alone, for checks and balances, it can't be abused because we have to ratify it. And it allows for just that, checks and balances. And because he cannot, like you pointed out, he can't terminate anyone. He can feel that this person should be a suspension, and he brings it back to the board. Hopefully by then we have the information and the investigation have been done, and if we ratify it, then we can then we can move on. I think that we should delete this from the mayor's powers to suspend.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Ferguson, you're recognized.
So this was one of the provisions that's somewhat redundant. You have a city manager who presumably you all has taken great pains to make sure is proficient at what he or she will do. Why would one need to have the mayor looking over his or her shoulder in that regard? Again, just an additional delay to the city business. So again, if you're trying to streamline things, why would you need a quasi-city manager who can suspend? If it works the way it's supposed to work and you all are as policymakers moving in concert with your city manager, you probably know what's going on, what the feel is here in your city. And so if the city manager, if you find the city manager is not doing what he or she needs to do, then you remove that person. Remove the city manager. Put somebody in place who's going to be diligent and make sure that they are keeping track of all their department heads or other persons inside of the city. Why would you necessarily need the mayor, based on the other functions and set forth in the mayor in the charter, to have this kind of ancillary responsibility, if you will? It just seems redundant, and again, from what's most efficient, what's most economic in terms of city business, it really doesn't seem to have any place. Furthermore, I believe the mayor mentioned to us at one of our recent meetings that I think he represented that he's not used the suspension provision. Twice. I was going to say 2 or 3 times. And that's fine, but again, it's just more so a fact of what's most efficient for the city. What's most efficient? What's the best thing for the city of Riviera Beach? Do we want to have a city manager and kind of, for lack of a better term, a quasi-city manager for this specific issue? Or do we want to trust ourselves that you 5 are going to do what you need to do as determined by the electorate, and you're going to charge the city manager, I didn't mean to point at you, Ms. Austin, but whoever's sitting in the city manager's position to make sure that the city manager is doing what he or she what he or she needs to do. There are other provisions inside the charter and other responsibilities the mayor arguably should focus on, and I believe our mayor is doing that. But nevertheless, this seems to be a kind of redundant provision that we would like to present to the electorate and see what they say this time.
Dr. Spigno, you recognize?
Well, I'm always for giving as much to the voters, even if it would mean the single-member districts, which got voted down. But the other issue, I think, is if that is true, that we really don't want to encumber the city with problems, what the council needs to think about is if you're going to have a supermajority to terminate a city manager, and there is a disagreement about an employee and a suspension, do you really want to go through, terminating a city manager because maybe there is an employee that's a friend of a city manager, there is some cronyism? It does happen after years. I think that one of you stated, sometimes we're reacting to a problem and not thinking of the best government we could have, absent of a recent problem within the last 12 months. And I think it's important that when you get our recommendations, you think about what's best for the city long term, not just the reaction to what took place the last 12 months.
Thank you. Item number 7, conflicts of interest, ethical. Pardon? Pardon?
Number 6.
Compensated appointed city officers.
Oh, I'm sorry. Restriction of former elected city officials. Any comment on that? Number 7. Conflicts of interest, ethical standards. Any comments on that? We've already addressed number 8 because we went backwards. We started there. So we're at the conclusion. What are your next steps, Charter Review Committee?
Madam Chairwoman, one question we would have, are there any other items that any member of the council could think of that they would like the Charter Review Board to look at as we finalize our recommendations and work?
Chair Pro Tem, you recognize?
I would like the board to look at no one council person chairing all 3 boards at the same time. To look into that, to discuss it, to see if the board has a desire to put that on.
Does that make the city's business more efficient if you had multiple?
It makes it, I think it's more, not just efficient and not just expedient, But what it has, it gives you more of a objective view. You get other vision involved. You get different ways of doing things. You won't have all three boards operating in the same manner. And I think it gives you. I think in the long run, it will make city business more efficient. You can imagine one person focusing on just the agenda for this one, and this one. But the investigation, the ideas, the opportunities to see that everybody gets a chance to get something on the agenda or their ideas brought forth to the public.
Madam Chair? Just one point on that. One thing you all could do is, without putting that in the charter, you could create an ordinance creating that restriction. You could, the council could adopt an ordinance that would create a restriction or a protocol like that.
Well, we didn't do very well on the desk with that. I'm saying that's why I would like it to go to the general public to get their feelings about it. I think that we should, I think if it would have passed on the desk, we would have created an ordinance. But I'd just like to, that's just my suggestion. Y'all asked if there was if something you wanted.
We appreciate that. Are there any other, if you have any other suggestions at this time, or if you want to attend the next meeting of the board with any further input? On our notice for the board meetings, we always include that individual council members may attend and may participate.
When is your next meeting?
Welcome to do that. The next meeting is October 25th, which is next Thursday.
One of the things that is going to have to be taken into consideration with this suggestion by Chair Pro Tem to have the chair, different person service chair, there is a small stipend that comes with the chair, so you would technically you would have to consider that as well when you're thinking about that, because if you have 3 separate chairs, you're going to have 3 separate chair stipends that accompany that, because that is a part. Well, maybe
it's only for the
city council.
I don't
But
think you get any.
But if you're doing that, if you're going to break it up and create a different scenario, are you going to then create that salary?
I think the protocols
I'm
go
just
with,
wondering.
I'm thinking whatever is in place that goes with that seat, goes with that seat. Just like it says we should have an election at the CRA, we should have an election at the utility district.
It's just something
We
to
have
think
failed to do that. We have refused to do that. So that's why I would like to see it come to the public. It's already stated in the language that you should hold an election at each board member when you sit for it, but it does not take place. So I'd like to have, again, that's my suggestion.
Councilwoman
A
Miller
question.
Anderson, and then Councilwoman Bolt. I heard her first. Councilwoman Miller Anderson.
I think the manner in which it always comes up is when the next person's time is about to come. And so I think maybe it would probably be accepted a little more if we implemented it during a time when no one is, when it's not an
When there's no election?
No election. Let's start at that, put it into effect to go for the next time, so that it really doesn't, because that's what happened last time, the last couple times, I believe it was that, it was someone's turn, and it's like, okay, why do you want to do it?
Someone's turn every year.
But no, I understand that, but the thing is, when you don't have an election, it's a little different, because you could have new people that come onto the dais, and so when that happens, you don't expect that person to then bump up into that spot. So I think that's what happened the last time we didn't
Not
have
the
an
last
election.
2 times. All of us have been here for the last 2 elections. When you first had your election, it was your turn.
Right.
And then Tanya came on. But what I'm saying, it wasn't like a new group of people. We all knew who was in succession and who should appropriately be the chair for the council. we had not put in it, we did not implement the CRA or the utility district, so nothing was in play. All we did was codify the fact that we had been allowing that to roll over into the next office, be it CRA or be it utility district. So that won't work. That won't work. Somebody's just gonna, nobody wants to step back and say, all I'm saying is nobody's gonna try to usurp your seat as a chairperson, whether it's me or Dr. Botel or whomever. No one's gonna try to take your seat as the chair. All we're saying is when you go to the CRA board, follow what it says. We should host an election for that. When utility district, it says we should host an election for that. We don't do it.
So in that scenario, if you go to, you have your chair that's elected to city council, at the next sitting of the CRA, there could be a vote to still have the chairperson to serve. So that doesn't necessarily net you the result that you are speaking of, because even if we take into consideration what the language says, is that there should be a vote, because the language doesn't say that the vote should be someone different other than who's serving as chair. And for the time frame that I've lived in the city of Riviera Beach and followed Riviera Beach government, the chairperson of the city council has sat as chair of USD.
They have.
So even if we got to the vote, I'm simply saying that does not necessarily, taking the vote to select a chair does not necessarily give you the outcome, the intended outcome.
It might not have, but we would never know. But I'm saying, since we're in a position to fatten it up, to tighten it up, we can state that
Where's
no.
that information
That's not in the
located?
charter.
We're not aware of that. Is it in the CRA ordinance in the utility?
It might be in
not
the
in the charter.
ordinance. It might. I don't think it's in the charter. It just says at the next city council meeting or the next CRA, you will hold a vote. I don't think that it's spelled out in the charter per se. So that's why I'm saying, and as the councilwoman pointed out, the chairwoman pointed out that they're not. If we just take a vote and we don't agree to create an ordinance among ourselves that say no one person can hold 2 seats, then you might not net the fair result. I just think that it is incumbent upon us to, if it's not something we can decide among ourselves, to bring it to the public that no one person serves as chair of two seats.
But what prohibits the motion to be raised at utility district meeting or CRA for a chair to be appointed? Is there something that prohibits that?
No.
No, there's not.
There's nothing
And then as
that
far as
prohibits
the
it.
remuneration goes, it's the city chair that gets the stipend. So I don't even think we have to get into the issue
Yeah, I
of
don't
proration.
even think it's
Yeah.
the stipend. That's
It's not the
what I'm
stipend.
talking
So
about.
just at the next term, just make a motion and say, I move that we appoint a chair for utility district or a CRA. And then if you get 3 votes, then so be it. Why do we need?
We
that-
could have done that a while if we were going, if that was, something that was
Okay.
doable, we would have done that, but.
Understood.
October 25th is the next meeting.
Correct.
You're over at the Ambassador Center again, beginning at 6 p.m.? 6:30 p.m.? Dear public, you are invited to join us at the next charter review meeting on October 25th, 6:30 p.m. at the Ambassador Center located on Singer Island. We hope that time will permit so that you can participate in this very important endeavor of the county. Are there any other of the city? Okay, so I went to work today, I'm sorry. Of the city. I want to say thank you so much for the work that you have done thus far. I am sure that there is quite a considerable amount of work to continue to be done, and I will look forward to participating in another meeting. I had the distinct pleasure of sitting in, ladies, on the discussion about drawing lots, flipping coins, pulling straws, and the likes. It was quite interesting, to say the very least. So if there are any other comments from board before we adjourn?
Madam Chair.
You're recognized.
To echo your thanks to this board, I appreciate tremendously the amount of work that you've put in. I also have visited on a number of occasions, and I thank you very much for the amount of work. It's an arduous task, and it's much appreciated. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Same, echo the same thing.
Okay.
Thank you for your service and thank you for your work. I would just like to announce that the District 1 office is going to be asking parents to register their children for the Boys to Men mentoring program. You'll hear more about it tomorrow night at the city council meeting, and we'll have the information for you. So we are giving you a heads up because we want you to know about it. We're going to be looking for 15 men to serve as mentors for these 15 young men that will be taken into the program. We're going to be going door to door in the National Village Timber Run area, recruiting young men from 12 to 18 years old. So, we have a lot of men in here tonight. So we would say to you, gentlemen, you two are invited to participate. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. There being no further comments, we stand adjourned.